You're exactly my type, you know that? The words landed before Malik Carter could even set the last corner of the bed frame down, soft but sharp enough to freeze the air in place. His hands still gripping the edge of the polished wood, muscles tight from carrying 80 pounds of boxed weight up 12 flights, because the service elevator had been down again, and for a second he thought maybe he heard her wrong. Maybe it was just another echo in another expensive apartment that didn't belong to him. But when he looked up, she was still there, standing barefoot on white marble floors that reflected the late afternoon sunlight like water, her expression calm, almost curious, not smiling, not teasing, just watching him like he was something unfamiliar she was trying to understand. And that was new, because people like her didn't usually look at him like that, not in places like this, not in a penthouse that probably cost more than everything he'd ever owned combined. And Malik felt that familiar instinct rise in his chest. The one that told him to nod politely, keep it professional, finish the job, and leave without making waves, because staying too long in rooms like this had never ended well for men like him. Men in work boots that left faint dust marks on perfect floors. Men whose names didn't get remembered after the delivery was done. But something about the way she said it, steady and unfiltered, made him pause longer than he should have. Just long enough for the silence to stretch between them, thick and noticeable. Like even the city noise outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had decided to hold its breath, and he cleared his throat quietly, adjusting his grip before lowering the frame into place with careful precision, making sure not to scratch anything. Because details mattered, they always mattered, especially when you were the one people expected to mess them up. And as he straightened, rolling his shoulders once to ease the strain, he kept his eyes on the work, not on her, not on the way. The sunlight caught in her hair or how still she stood, because looking too long would mean acknowledging something he wasn't supposed to. And Malik Carter had built his life on knowing exactly where the line was and never crossing it. But then she moved, just a step closer, her reflection shifting across the glass behind him, and he could feel it without turning, that quiet attention, not heavy, not judging, just present. And that was what unsettled him the most, because presence meant intention, and intention in spaces like this usually came with a cost he wasn't willing to pay. So he reached for his clipboard instead, fingers steady, voice even when he finally spoke. I just need a signature here, ma'am. Simple, safe, the kind of sentence that kept things where they belonged. But even as he said it, he could feel that something had already shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm when the air changes temperature without warning. And for the first time that day, Malik wasn't entirely sure if finishing the delivery would be the end of the story, or just the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Malik kept his eyes on the clipboard longer than necessary, the cheap plastic edge pressing lightly into his palm, as if grounding him back into something familiar, something structured, because everything about this apartment felt the opposite of that, too open, too quiet, too aware. And when she took the pen from his hand, her fingers brushed his for just a fraction of a second, not lingering, not intentional, but enough to register, enough to remind him that this was real and not just some strange moment he would laugh off later with the guys at the warehouse. And he stepped back instinctively, giving her space, watching as she signed her name in smooth, unhurried strokes. Like time moved differently up here, like deadlines and hourly wages did not exist above the city noise that barely reached this height. And when she handed the clipboard back, she did not step away, did not turn toward her phone or another room like most customers did the second the transaction was complete. Instead, she stayed right there, studying him again with that same quiet focus that made him shift his weight slightly from one foot to the other, boots creaking softly against the marble. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muted honk of traffic 12 floors below. And Malik broke the silence the only way he knew how. Practical, contained, frame is set. But one leg was slightly uneven. I adjusted it so it will not rock. His voice steady, professional, the kind of explanation he gave every time. But she tilted her head slightly, as if he had said something more than that, as if she was listening between the words instead of to them. You noticed that without testing it first, she said, not a question, more like an observation she was confirming out loud, and he shrugged lightly, already reaching for his tool bag. You learn to see it after a while. Simple, nothing special, just experience. but the way she nodded made it feel like something else entirely, like she was cataloging pieces of him he had never thought were worth noticing. And that made him uncomfortable in a way he could not quite explain, because attention like that usually came with expectations, and expectations meant pressure, and pressure was something he had spent years learning how to avoid. So he zipped his bag a little faster than necessary, the metallic sound sharp in the quiet room, and moved toward the door. "You are all set," he added, keeping his tone polite but distant, the exit already mapped out in his mind. Down the hallway, left at the elevator, back to the truck, back to normal. But then her voice came again, softer this time, not stopping him with authority, but with something quieter, something harder to ignore. "Malik," she said, reading his name from the badge clipped to his shirt, and he paused, just for a second, his hand hovering near the door handle as he turned slightly, not fully facing her, not fully leaving either. And there was a shift in her expression, subtle but real, like whatever she was about to say mattered more than the line she had opened with. And for the first time since he stepped into the apartment, Malik felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not tension, not exactly, but something close to it, like the beginning of a question he was not sure he wanted answered. He did not like the way his name sounded in her voice, not because of how she said it, but because she said it at all, like it meant something beyond the stitched letters on his shirt. And Malik turned just enough to acknowledge her, shoulders still angled toward the door, body already halfway gone even if his feet had not moved yet. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, keeping it neutral, keeping it safe. But she did not respond right away, and that pause stretched again, thinner this time but sharper, like something precise was being measured in the silence between them. And when she finally spoke, her tone had changed, less observational, more certain. "You almost left without asking why I said that," she said. And that caught him off guard more than the words themselves, because she was right. He had not asked. He had not even considered asking. And that was not because he was not curious, but because curiosity had a cost he had learned not to pay in spaces like this. So he gave a small, controlled nod. "Not my place to ask," he replied, honest and simple. And for the first time, she smiled. Not wide, not playful, just a small shift at the corner of her mouth that felt less like amusement and more like recognition. Like she had expected that answer before he even gave it. And she stepped closer, not enough to invade his space, but enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier. And the light from the windows shifted with her movement, casting a soft reflection across the polished floor that reached the edge of his boots. And she glanced down briefly, noticing the faint dust marks he had tried to avoid leaving behind, then back up at him. "You clean as you go," she said, again not a question. And Malik followed her gaze for a second before answering. "Habit," but inside, something tightened, because she was seeing too much, connecting too many small details that most people ignored. And that made him uneasy in a way he could not easily shake, because being seen like that meant being understood, and being understood meant being exposed, and exposed meant vulnerable. And vulnerability was not something he allowed himself in rooms where he did not control the outcome. So he adjusted the strap of his tool bag on his shoulder, grounding himself again, reminding himself where he stood, who he was, what this was, just a delivery, just another stop, just another door he would walk out of and never think about again. But she spoke before he could move, her voice softer now, almost careful. "You pay attention to things most people overlook," she said. And there was something in the way she said it that made it clear she was not talking about the bed frame anymore. And Malik met her eyes fully for the first time since she called his name. And there it was again, that steady gaze, not demanding, not judging, just present, waiting, and he felt that same unfamiliar pressure build in his chest, not heavy, not overwhelming, but enough to make him choose his next words more carefully than usual. "That is part of the job," he answered, but even as he said it, he knew it was not the whole truth, and something in her expression told him she knew it too. And the space between them held that unspoken understanding for a moment, quiet but undeniable, like a door neither of them had opened yet, but both knew was there. Malik let the silence sit for one more second, then another, as if stretching it might make whatever was forming between them fade back into something ordinary, something easier to walk away from. But it did not. It only sharpened, and he shifted his stance slightly, the weight of his tool bag pressing into his shoulder as a reminder of who he was in this space. what his role was supposed to be, and he nodded once. A small motion meant to close the moment rather than continue it. I should get going, he said, voice calm but firmer now, placing a boundary where things had started to blur, and for a brief instant he expected her to step back, to let him leave like every other customer would, to return to her world and let him return to his. But she did not move, and that stillness carried more intention than any step forward could have. You always do that, she asked, her tone even. But there was something underneath it now, something closer to challenge than curiosity, and Malik paused, fingers brushing the cold metal of the door handle without turning it. Do what? He replied, though he already knew, and she held his gaze, steady as before. Leave before something has a chance to be real, she said, and the words did not hit loud. They settled, quiet and precise, like they had been waiting for the right moment to land. And Malik exhaled slowly through his nose, not annoyed, not offended, but measured, because that was not a question about the delivery anymore, not about the bed or the room or anything visible. That was about him, and that was a line he did not let people cross, not strangers, not clients, not anyone who had only known him for less than 10 minutes. And yet here she was, standing in a space that was entirely hers. Speaking like she had already mapped something out about him he had spent years keeping controlled, and he straightened slightly, turning just enough to face her fully now, no longer halfway out the door, because if he was going to answer, he was not going to do it halfway. I leave when the job is done, he said, each word placed carefully, solid, something that could not be easily pushed against, and for a second, that seemed to settle it. The room quiet again except for the faint hum of the city far below. But then she nodded slowly, like she accepted his answer and understood it at the same time. That is not what I meant, she said, softer. Now, and the shift in her voice took the edge off the moment without removing the weight of it, and she glanced briefly toward the bed frame he had just finished, then back to him. You fix things, you make sure they are stable, and then you step away before you have to stay. And there was no accusation in it, no judgment. Just a clear observation that felt more personal than anything she had said so far. And Malik felt that same tension return, not sharp, but deep, the kind that sat behind his ribs and made him aware of his own breathing. And he did not answer right away this time, because there was no simple, safe response to that, no professional script to fall back on. And for the first time since he walked into the apartment, he realized that leaving now would not feel as clean as it usually did. Like something unfinished would follow him out the door whether he wanted it to or not. And that realization alone made him hesitate just a second longer than he intended. The hesitation lingered just long enough to feel deliberate, and Malik became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that should not be there, subtle but impossible to ignore, and he tightened his grip on the strap of his tool bag, grounding himself again in something physical, something certain, because everything else in that room had started to feel uncertain in a way he did not trust, and he let out a quiet breath before speaking, his voice lower now, not defensive, but firm in a way that came from practice. You are reading too much into a delivery, he said, choosing each word carefully, placing distance back between them with tone alone if not with space. And for a moment it seemed like that might be enough, like the boundary would hold. But Evelyn did not look away, did not step back, did not retreat into the comfort of her position or the safety of silence. Instead she nodded slightly, as if she accepted his pushback without agreeing with it. And that made the tension stretch again, thinner now, but stronger, like a wire pulled tight between 2 points. And she folded her arms loosely, not closed off, just settled, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she was not in a hurry for the moment to end. Maybe I am, she said quietly, and there was no challenge in it this time, no edge, just honesty. And that disarmed him more than anything else she had said so far, because honesty was harder to deflect than curiosity, harder to walk away from without acknowledging it. And Malik shifted his weight again, the faint sound of his boots against the floor breaking the silence for a second before it settled back in, and he glanced toward the window without meaning to. The city stretched out below in grids of movement and light, distant and separate, a reminder that there was a world outside this room that made sense, a world where roles were clear and expectations were known. And he could feel the pull of that world now, steady and familiar. urging him toward the door, toward the elevator, toward the truck waiting somewhere far below. But when he looked back at her, she was still there, still watching him with that same steady attention, and something about that steadiness made it harder to leave than it should have been, and he frowned slightly, not at her, but at the situation, at the way it was unfolding outside of his control. "Look," he started, his voice measured, trying to bring things back to something simple, something he could manage. "I do my job, I make sure things are right, and then I move on. That is it." And there was weight in that statement, more than the words alone carried. Something lived in it, something built over time, and Evelyn's expression shifted just slightly, not softer, but more focused, like she had just found the piece she had been looking for. "And if something is not right after you leave?" she asked, her tone calm, almost gentle, but the question itself settled heavier than anything before it, and Malik held her gaze for a second, then another, and there it was again, that space where he could choose the easy answer or the true one. And for a moment he said nothing, because the truth was not something he handed out easily, not in places like this, not to people like her, and yet the silence itself began to feel like an answer, one he could not fully control, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just a fraction as he finally spoke, quieter now, less guarded than before. "Then it was never mine to fix in the first place." And the words hung there between them, simple but final, like a line drawn not on the floor, but somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to step across. And for the first time since she spoke his name, Malik felt the moment settle into something heavier than tension, something closer to truth. And he was not sure whether that made it easier to leave or harder. The words settled into the room and did not move, like dust caught in a beam of light, visible and quiet at the same time. And for a long second neither of them spoke, because there was nothing immediate to add to something that complete, and Malik felt it in the way his chest rose and fell, slower now, steadier, like something inside him had shifted without asking permission, and he became aware of the small details again. The faint hum of the air system, the distant rhythm of traffic below, the soft reflection of sunlight stretching across the floor and touching the edge of the bed frame he had just assembled, and it grounded him, pulled him back into the physical world where things had shape and weight and clear purpose, and he let his gaze drift for a moment, not away from her, but around the space, taking in the clean lines of the room, the absence of clutter, the way everything seemed placed with intention but not warmth. And that was when he noticed it, subtle but present, the kind of detail most people would overlook, but he could not. The slight indentation on the pillow, the faint crease on the edge of the mattress like it had been tested but not used, the stillness of a space that was lived in, but not shared. And something in that observation connected quietly with what she had said earlier, not as a conclusion, but as a question that did not need to be spoken out loud. And when he looked back at her, her posture had changed just slightly, not defensive, not guarded, but still, like she was waiting without pushing, giving the moment room to breathe instead of forcing it forward. And that was new, that kind of patience, that kind of restraint, and it made the silence feel less like pressure and more like space. And Malik shifted his weight again, slower this time, less like he was preparing to leave and more like he was deciding whether he needed to. And he let his hand fall away from the door handle without fully realizing it, the small metallic click of it brushing against the frame barely audible. And he spoke again, not to fill the silence, but because something needed to be said, even if it was not everything. "You ever had something look perfect and still not feel right?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not directed at her as much as shared into the space between them. And she did not answer immediately, but her eyes moved slightly, following the line of the bed frame, the placement of the pillows, the clean symmetry of the room, and then back to him. And when she finally spoke, her voice matched his, low and even. "Every day," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no performance, just truth. And that word hung there between them, heavier than the silence before it, because it did not ask for anything, it did not push, it simply existed. And Malik nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not agreement, not resolution, just recognition, and for the first time since he stepped into the apartment, the space between them did not feel like a line to cross or a distance to maintain. It felt like something else entirely, something undefined but real, and he stood there a moment longer, not moving toward the door, not moving away either, just standing in a space that no longer felt temporary, even if he knew it still was. Her answer did not echo. It settled, like it belonged there long before he asked the question, and Malik felt it in the stillness that followed, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just real in a way that made everything else in the room feel less important. And for a moment he forgot about the door, the truck waiting outside, the schedule printed on his clipboard that told him where he was supposed to be next, because none of that pressed on him the way it usually did, and he studied her again, not as a customer now, not as someone on the other side of a transaction, but as a person standing in a space that felt as unfinished as his own thoughts. And there was something in her posture, the way her shoulders were relaxed but not at ease, the way her eyes held steady without trying to prove anything, that told him her answer had not been casual, it had been lived, and that realization shifted something inside him, small but undeniable, like a lock turning just one notch without fully opening. And he glanced again at the room, at the perfect lines, the untouched surfaces, the quiet that felt more like absence than peace, and then back at her. And this time when he spoke, his voice carried less distance than before. "So why keep it like this?" he asked, not accusing, not challenging, just asking something that had been sitting between them without words, and she exhaled slowly, the first visible release of breath since he had stepped into the apartment, and her gaze moved briefly toward the window, the city stretching out beyond the glass like a map of lives moving in directions neither of them could see from up here. And when she spoke, her voice was softer, but clearer than anything she had said so far. "Because it is easier to control how things look than how they feel," she said, and the honesty in it did not ask for sympathy, did not seek agreement. It simply existed, and Malik nodded once, understanding more than he expected to, because that was not a world he lived in, but it was a truth he recognized, just from a different angle, and he shifted his stance again. But this time it was not toward the door, it was toward the center of the room, a subtle movement that changed the space between them, made it less about leaving and more about staying, even if only for a moment longer, and he let his tool bag rest against his leg, no longer gripping it like an anchor, and the room seemed to breathe with that small change, the silence no longer waiting for an exit, but holding something that had not yet been decided. And he looked at her again, steady this time, no hesitation in meeting her gaze. "You ever try letting it not be perfect?" he asked, and there was no edge in it, no expectation, just a question that carried the same weight as hers had earlier. And for a second she did not answer, her eyes holding his, something shifting behind them that was not immediate or easy. And then she gave a small shake of her head, not dismissive, just honest. "I would not know where to start," she said, and that admission did not sound like weakness. It sounded like truth, and Malik felt something settle in his chest, not tension, not uncertainty, but something quieter, something closer to clarity, and he gave a slight nod, almost to himself, as if marking the moment without needing to define it. And the room remained still around them, but no longer empty, no longer just a place where a job had been completed. Now it held something else, something unfinished in a different way, something that neither of them had planned, but neither of them was stepping away from just yet. The admission did not linger in the air the way the others had. It settled deeper, quieter, like something that had been waiting for permission to exist, and Malik felt it not as a shift in the room, but as a shift in her, subtle but unmistakable, and he studied her for a second longer, not analyzing, not measuring, just seeing. And for the first time since he walked in, the space around her did not feel controlled. It felt uncertain in a way that was honest, and that honesty made everything else in the room seem less important. The clean lines, the perfect placement, the careful symmetry, all of it fading slightly into the background as something more real took its place. And Malik exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing without him realizing it. And he nodded once, not as a conclusion, but as acknowledgement. And then he did something small, something simple, but deliberate. He stepped past the point where he had been standing since the moment she called his name, moving fully into the room instead of hovering at its edge, and the shift was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed the space between them completely, no longer divided by an exit, no longer defined by distance. And he set his tool bag down beside the wall, not dropping it, not abandoning it, just placing it there, like he was allowing himself a moment without needing to hold on to it. and Evelyn noticed. Not the movement itself, but what it meant, and her gaze softened slightly, not in relief, but in recognition, and for a second neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to fill, nothing to push forward, just a shared awareness of something changing without being named, and Malik glanced toward the bed again. The frame steady, the alignment precise, everything exactly as it should be, and yet it carried none of the warmth a bed was meant to hold, and he walked toward it slowly, his steps measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just intentional, and he reached out, adjusting the corner of the sheet just slightly, smoothing a fold that did not need fixing, not because it was wrong, but because it felt incomplete, and he stepped back, looking at it again, then at her, and his voice when he spoke was quieter than before, not guarded, not distant, just present. "It does not have to start big," he said, and there was no instruction in it, no pressure, just a simple truth offered without expectation, and Evelyn held his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment before something in it shifted, not into certainty, but into willingness, a small opening where control used to be, and she took a step closer, not toward him, but toward the space between them, and she glanced at the bed, then back at him. "Then where does it start?" she asked, and the question was not rhetorical this time. It was real, and Malik considered it for a second, not searching for the right answer, but for an honest one, and he gave a slight nod toward the room, toward the quiet, toward the stillness that had filled every corner since he arrived. "With something that is not perfect," he said, and the words did not resolve anything. They did not fix the space or define what came next, but they changed the way the silence felt, no longer empty, no longer controlled. Now it held possibility, and for the first time, neither of them seemed in a hurry to end it. The room did not change all at once. There was no sudden shift, no dramatic moment that marked the difference, just a quiet unfolding, like something long held in place had finally loosened without needing permission, and Malik stood there for a second longer, his eyes moving once more across the space, not inspecting, not correcting, just seeing it for what it was, a place that had been built to look complete but had never been allowed to feel lived in. And he picked up his tool bag slowly. This time, not with urgency, not as an escape, just as a natural next step. And when he turned toward the door again, it did not feel like retreat, it felt like choice, and that difference settled deep, steady, and clear, and Evelyn watched him, not with the same searching gaze as before, but with something quieter, something that did not try to define or hold on to the moment. And when he reached the door, his hand resting lightly against the handle, he paused, not because he was unsure, but because the silence behind him had changed. It was no longer waiting for something to happen. It had already held something real, and that was enough. And he glanced back once, meeting her eyes without hesitation, and there was no need for explanation, no need for promises or plans, just a shared understanding that something had shifted in a way neither of them could fully measure yet. And he gave a small nod, simple, respectful, and she returned it just as quietly, and he opened the door, the soft click breaking the stillness for the first time in minutes, and stepped into the hallway where the air felt different, cooler, more defined, the sounds of distant footsteps and elevator chimes returning like the world resuming its rhythm. And he walked toward the elevator, his boots steady against the floor, each step grounded in something that felt more certain than when he had arrived. And behind him, the door closed gently, not with finality, but with calm, and inside the apartment, Evelyn remained where she was for a moment, then turned slowly toward the bed, the one thing in the room that had been touched, adjusted, acknowledged beyond its surface, and she stepped closer, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the sheet where he had smoothed it, not to fix it, not to perfect it, just to feel it, and she sat down, not carefully, not with the precision that had defined everything else in the room, but simply, allowing the slight crease beneath her to remain. And the room held that imperfection quietly, without resistance, without correction, and for the first time since she had moved into the space, the silence did not feel controlled. It felt present, like something that could grow instead of something that needed to be maintained. And outside, far below, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the small shift that had taken place 12 floors above, and Malik stepped out of the building minutes later. The late afternoon sun hitting his face as he adjusted the strap on his shoulder, and he did not look back. Not because it did not matter, but because it did, and some things were better carried forward than turned around to be checked. And as he walked toward his truck, the noise of the street rising around him, there was no clear answer, no defined outcome, just a quiet certainty that something real had passed between two people who were not supposed to meet in that way. And that was enough to leave a mark that did not need to be seen to be understood.